Well, good morning. It's good to see you. Glad to be here. I'm really grateful that you're here today. We are on an adventure, and we've been talking about luggage, the luggage that we bring with us, because what we believe and what we think is true is that every one of us, whether we're aware of it or not, we are making sense of life, and we believe that somehow, through the life that we're currently living, through the ways that we think we can find meaning and purpose, pleasure, all of the stuff of life, we have a way that we believe that we're accomplishing that. And we have ways that we think that putting our lives together in certain ways will either bring that or keep that from happening. And so what we're asking as we enter into this series is for all of us to kind of open up our luggage and just kind of find out the stuff that's in there. Very glad this was in there today. But finding out what is it that when we think about our lives and what it means that we've put into this luggage that we haul around with us and believe that somehow we'll find life. We believe this to the core of our being, is that Jesus is the very center of what it means to live. Now that may be something that you say, well, yeah, of course, that's why we're here today, because we believe that too. But for some of us, that's a concept that we aren't quite sure of. And we're unaware if we really believe that Jesus has a way for that to happen. And if we're really honest, some of us would have to confess today that Jesus is nice because he kind of promises that we're forgiven and that someday we'll go to heaven, but we don't think of him necessarily as the one that we've built our lives around, that we take our cues from, that allow him to convict us and challenge us. And then as we look at him, we see our lives take different turns because we're following after him. And that's the hope of this series, that we are so willing to look at Jesus over and over and over, that as we do, we find that our life actually begins to take on a new shape and a new form, that it's bothered by things that bother the heart of God, that we rejoice in the things that God rejoices in, that we find life in the things that God has told us we would find life in and that are true always. Now, I'm going to date myself. This is 1995. Some of you know that year. Remember it? There's a particular song that came out that I, even the last couple weeks as I've been playing it and listening to it again, it's a song that gets stuck in my brain. And I just find myself singing it. And to anyone that has to hear that is devastating. But if it's a song that is so catchy, but the words to it are so interesting. Maybe you've heard this line, what if God were one of us? What if God was one of us? And I'm not singing it. What if God was one of us? You know that song? What if God was one of us? What if he was a slob like one of us? That's how the lyrics go. And you can go and look it up. Joan Osborne, 1995, high school, junior year. Over and over and over, I played that song. But the interesting thing about that song is that there is something about that was captivating. It captivated a generation, and it captivated it so much that song rose on all the charts and everything else as we began to ask that question, what if God was one of us? And so I'm going to do a little experiment here. I want you to imagine in your mind for 1 second, if you were to walk in a room and Jesus was in that room, what would he look like? What would you see? How would you know that that's him? Okay? You got a picture in your mind? How many of you look something like this? Anybody? I mean, I looked up, I spent way too much time Googling pictures of Jesus recently. But in some way, this Abercrombie & Fitch look-alike shows up in all kinds of forms. And it's fascinating to me that this is the picture. And in fact, this picture is distributed more widely around the world than any other picture of Jesus, billions of times. And so many people have had that picture or something like it. Now, I was reminded that there is a new picture of Jesus that maybe some of you have become more accustomed to, and that's the Chosen picture of Jesus, or the show called Chosen. That's the image. Everyone tells me about this show. I've yet to watch it, and I probably need to, but we have some kind of a picture, right, that we think that Jesus looks like. Something that we have in our minds of what that is. Now, image is one thing, but we also have beliefs about him. We have beliefs about who he is and what he expects and what he does and what he would be like and how he would engage in the world. I had a friend many, many years ago who used to say this: Jesus is just like me, just gooder. And he would say that and kind of have this cheeky little grin as he said it. And I was thinking about that statement and thinking, Jesus is just like me, just gooder. Get past the English of that. But you get past that and you say, what are we saying? That there was something, and I don't know if this was true of Terry or not, but there was something underneath that said, what I really like is to think that Jesus is just a little bit better version of me. I mean, because if he's just a little bit better version of me, then that means that if I just keep trying hard, I can eventually become a little bit better me. But here's the truth. This is the secret that we have to uncover is that we can't afford Jesus to be just a little bit gooder than us. Jesus has to be wholly other. He has to be wholly perfect. He has to be the God incarnate who is in the midst of our world that we might know who God is. It's so important that Jesus is just not a little bit better of a human. He is the perfect human. He shows us perfectly what it looks like to follow Jesus. If you followed us at all through 2024, you know that we talked throughout the series we were in about the Old Testament. We were there for a full year. We camped out there. And over and over and over, we kept talking about the important place that God would interject into human history and call us to honor him above all else, above all idols, to be people of justice and love and grace and mercy, just as he was to the people that he dealt with. But then he perfectly shows us what that is in Jesus. And so Jesus cannot simply be just a little bit better version of you and I. He actually needs to be God. And he needs to be the one that we align our lives around. So here's my invitation for us. Some have followed Jesus for a long, long time, and I just want to encourage you, because the other image we've been using in this series is of eyeglasses. And with the eyeglasses, we've been saying it's really important that we have the very best lenses to look through to understand who God is, and we see that through Jesus. But for some of us, our lenses need changed, or they need adjusted. They need to be changed out completely so that when we put them on, what we see through is actually a picture of who God is. And it illuminates it in a way that things are clearer and more beautiful than we could have ever imagined. And so through this series, there's two images I want you to work with. What are you bringing with you? And what are you looking through to see Jesus? Because those two things go a long way in helping us clarify how we live and what we would even expect of life. So we're going to be in Colossians, chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. So if you have your Bible, you can get there on your phone, or it'll be up on the screen if you'd prefer to do it that way. But just as a little bit of background, the Apostle Paul, one of the very first evangelists that took the message of Jesus so impacted him, so transformed him, that Paul's call to life was to take the message of Jesus throughout the ancient world. And everywhere he went, he found the places where he could get into teaching and demonstrating and showing the power of God. Paul himself was not a very impressive person, at least as we understand through the scriptures. And he says that, in fact, it's all my weaknesses that really turned out to be the things that God used to allow other people to see the beauty of God. But as he's writing to this church, the people in Colossae, the churches there, he wants them to understand that Jesus is not just one of them. He's not just somebody that does life well. Jesus, in fact, is the Son of God, and everything about all of creation is about him. And so I want to read these verses 15 through 20, and you can follow along. And then we're going to look at three things that Paul states in here that give us a launching pad to then investigate why it was that God showed up as he did, when he did, how he did into our world. So here's Paul's words. This is kind of a poem in the Greek. It's written in a way to kind of a hymn type way. It says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross." Three pieces that I want us to focus on before we jump into the particular sense of Jesus coming. The first is this, that when we look at Jesus, we see a picture of God. Now, this is really important because in the Greek way of understanding life, you could see one thing and seeing that meant you saw the other. But sometimes in the way that we in a Western culture have come to think about this is we see Jesus, but he's not quite the full thing. We're just seeing kind of an outline, but we really need to know the God behind him. And that was a foreign thought to the first century. What they would have understood is that when we see Jesus, we see in fullness who God is. In Jesus, if we want to make sense of our life, make sense of the world, make sense of how we're supposed to act and what we're supposed to do and how we treat people, we look to Jesus. Because it's Jesus we see the very picture of how God has shown himself to interact in the world for centuries. And this is so important for us today. You might have some vision of Jesus that you would say, I mean, he's a good guy, he's someone I can look at, but really, there is more to the story than just him. I'd actually like to see behind the scenes to know what God's really like. And Paul would say, no, friend, there is no further that you need to look. When you see Jesus in his fullness, you see God. And when you want to know what it's like to live in this world with the power of God in the midst of it, you look to Jesus, because in him you will understand life. The second thing Paul points out is that Jesus is a part of all of creation. And what's amazing is that Jesus was part of the original creation. And if you remember all the way back to what we've been talking about of the Garden of Eden, and in that was a perfect relationship between God and humanity. And in that relationship, Jesus was there. In fact, the Apostle John, he in his first chapter kind of pulls that all together and pulls it into this sense that when Jesus shows up into the world, it is the very picture of creation from the beginning taking place, and that in him we have life. And so this very beginning of Eden shows up now as Jesus is here, but now in Jesus is a picture of what it looks like for all of creation to be restored, to be made whole, to be redeemed, to be put back together as it was supposed to be. And this is the picture that Paul wants them to understand about what Jesus is doing in creation. And then lastly, is Jesus reveals what it means to be a human. He shows us a picture of what it looks like to be human, to care for one another, to live life in faithfulness to God, and to caring and ministering and walking with people in the vertical. This is this threefold sense of what Paul is writing. And in it, he says, Jesus is the head of the church. And when we gather this all the people in the world who have come to faith to believe that Jesus is truly the Son of God, he is the picture of God. In him we have salvation Through him, we find forgiveness of sin. Through him, we see the destruction of sin and death. Through him, we have the hope of things being restored and redeemed. That in him, we see a picture of what it looks like to be empowered by God to live out faithfully a life of goodness and mercy and grace and love into the world in which we live. And this is really important because for some of us, for me, I'll own it. For me, it is very easy to live in such a way that I can hold certain aspects of my life outside the light of Jesus because I'm not always wanting to live like him. I don't always want to forgive. I don't always want to bless others. I don't always want to call out the beauty and the goodness around me. Sometimes I want to treat my wife poorly. You say, what? How could you? Come on, you do too, right? There's times where you know what you should do, but you just say, you know what? That is not what I want to do. And it's in those moments that we're critiqued and we're called again to follow after Jesus because he's the picture of what it looks like to live in this world. I don't know where you've been, but this week it feels like there's a lot of noise in our world. There's just a lot of stuff going on. And trying to understand what it looks like to be faithful as a follower of Jesus in Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, there are challenges for me of knowing, God, what am I even supposed to be thinking? What am I supposed to be upholding? What am I supposed to be holding on to? How do I come near people who are hurting and are grieving? God, how in the world do I live into this world in a way that is faithful to you? And that's the question that has been on my heart and in my mind all week. What is helpful in this is to remember that God came into the world and he lived in such a way that he gave us a picture of what it looks like. There's this theological term that we call the scandal of particularity. And this is simply saying that God he incarnated into the world, but he did so with a particular purpose, in a particular way, in a particular place, with characteristic and human flesh on him. And so there had to be this place where he showed up. But what's true in this is that because he showed up in a place and in a certain way, the way that we watch him live there was important because it showed us how he was going to engage with all of the world. Now I'm going to go backwards for just a second because this is important for us. Is that when we saw Noah, God made a covenant with a person, with Noah. And it started there. You might remember Noah and his ark and that whole story. But God was individual. He made that with Noah. Then comes along Abraham. And God makes a covenant with Abraham, but he makes a covenant with Abraham with a family. He said, your family is going to be the representation into the world of how I treat people and who I am. And then when people see you as a family, they're going to see me, and I'm going to multiply your family, and it's going to be amazing. And then God used Moses, and he did this with a people. See, the family had grown, and it became a people. And God said, I'm going to use you as a people. You're now going to live as people who represent me into all the world. And so when people wonder who I am, they look to see you and they see the faithfulness you have with me. And that's how they'll know who I am. And then he sends Jesus. And Jesus moves away from just an individual, not just a family, not just a people, but Jesus now is the very representation of God to have the arms wide open for the entirety of anyone in the world to come to know who he was. It just continued to increase in its scope and in its influence and its impact. And in Jesus, we begin to see this movement that now all people that would ever come to know God would come through him. And in coming to him, they would be part of this family that was started way, way back here. So, if you have a picture of Jesus like this, that he came to care for all the world, the very first place that you might need to unpack some stuff and look at that and say, you know what, actually, scientists have said that Jesus probably looked a little bit more like this. You say, what? I've never seen that picture of Jesus. Right. Because guess who wasn't painting the pictures since 1600? Guess where the pictures that we've formed in our minds come from? And this is amazing, right? So much of art and so much of the way we capture things is that we want to know God in our image. We want to know him like us. And if you go to some stores, like the 10,000 Villages is a store, if you've ever been in there, you might see that from around the world there are pictures of Jesus, and they all look so different because they represent the people in a really interesting way from where they were painted. And Jesus has a very different look. And so what we begin with is understanding that when Jesus came into the world, he came into that region of the world, Palestine, Israel area. And so when he did so, his human form looked like that area of the world. And it probably looked a little bit more like this. Now, I wish they'd have done something a little different with the eyes, right? This isn't supposed to be Jesus, but he looks like he just saw a ghost or something, right? But here's what else happens. As Jesus comes into the world, he enters into a whole bunch of situations and a whole bunch of stations that really mattered. And they matter to us today to understand how he came into the world. Now, I want to be honest as I say this. If you were God or if I was God, I think I would have done things way differently. I would have chosen to have Jesus come in a lot of fanfare, with a lot of power, with a lot of prestige. I mean, I was thinking about this even in how I have sent resumes out at different times in my life. I don't know if you've done this yourself, but when you send out a resume, you're trying to make yourself look really flashy. And so there were some times where I might have served on a board of about 6 people, but my term for that board that I served on looked really impressive. Or there might have been this class that I taught that was really pretty bland, but the way that I put it into a resume, I make it sound really impressive. You ever done things like that? You ever had people sitting around telling stories and you just start noticing that internally you start feeling like you've not accomplished anything in your life? And you're hearing them kind of go on and on and on and tell these stories until eventually you get to be like, well, I got to tell something about myself, because otherwise I just look like I've done nothing. There's something in us that pushes us back against the regular or the mundane, and yet that's the very place that God chose to show up in our world. And so if we start at this in Matthew 1:1, and we see this in numerous places, but Jesus shows up as the promised Messiah as a Jew. And he has a location, an ethnic location. And in that, as a Jew, he was not seen in great standing within the Roman Empire. I mean, they put up with them, but they better not get out of line, and they better not overstep their loyalties, because the Roman Empire was the king of the day. He shows up and not wealthy, right? We see that when they took him to the temple to be on the 8th day, they offered doves. The doves were for those who didn't have a lot of money. They were the sacrifice made to dedicate their child. And so we see that he came from a family of just very ordinary or poor means. He didn't come as a rich kid. His birth, this is the one, right? I think, God, you could have saved so much scandal if you would have just had Jesus come in that context, in that situation, into a family that was already established, right? There wouldn't have been questions about a Virgin Mary having a kid and the scandal that happened around that. God, why did you decide to do it that way? But that's where the birth story is, that with Mary, a virgin, she comes to be pregnant. She's almost divorced by her fiance, Joseph, until God sends angels and they hear this message, and they both, to their courageous credit, say, God, we will trust you and we will walk into that. Into this family, a carpenter family. Think about this. That picture that I showed you a little bit earlier, that's kind of the most famous picture of Jesus. What do you think that picture of Jesus' hands felt like? I mean, that's kind of a weird question, right? If you shook his hands, what do you think they felt like? And if you know a carpenter, what did their hands feel like? He comes in as a carpenter's kid. He's building things. He's doing what his dad did. He would have been a pretty blue-collar kind of guy. That isn't at all what the pictures represent for me. I see him as somebody that kind of stands aloof to that hard work, sweat equity. But somehow this is the picture of what Jesus came into in his family. He was from Nazareth. You may have heard this before, but Thomas says, can anything good come from Nazareth? You remember that? I don't know if you've ever thought about this about your place of birth, but it's interesting to me that if you tell somebody you're from somewhere really kind of fascinating, they're really interested in it. When you tell them that you're from some podunk little place on the globe, they go, oh, that's nice, right? I mean, why didn't Jesus come from the center of where things were happening? Why didn't he come from Rome or Corinth or some big city? Like, why didn't he come from somewhere where he would have been somebody? But instead he comes from a place where everyone says, can anything good come from there? And then, get this. This is how we know that there's something special, though, going on. Jesus comes in, and who are the first people to see him? The shepherds, right? The shepherds were not well liked. They're on the outskirts of society. They're unclean and unfit and all of that, so they're out there. But then the next story of people that we see come to visit Jesus 2 years into his life or somewhere in there were the Magi. These rich people from Arabia, they come to worship him. And as they came to worship him, they talk to Herod and they say, Herod, we're looking for this Messiah who we followed his star. And Herod's like, oh, really? Well, when you find him, come back and tell me so that I could go worship him too. They eventually leave and they take off in a different direction. Herod finds this out, and what does he do? He decides that the best way to protect himself, the Roman government, is to kill all the kids under 2 years old. There aren't many stories when we talk about that part of it. But something is radical, isn't it? When government officials decide that the only way to assure themselves to maintain their control and their power is to destroy the children 2 years old or younger. I mean, think about that story. Think about how threatening he was to Herod. Think of what's taking place and shaping up that on the outskirts of everything, to a family of modest means or poor means, in an out-of-the-way place, to a virgin that he was born, to a carpenter who's done nothing of fame, would cause Herod to decide that the best way to deal with this is to wipe out all the kids so that he doesn't have to compete. There's something happening on the outskirts. There's something happening, this scandal of particularity, when God enters in and incarnates into our world with flesh. The very power of God is beginning to upend the powers of our world. It's beginning to shape a new story and tell a new way to be truly human. And this story is so important. And so we have to ask the question, well, why in the world does this matter? Because we could sit here today and we could say, you know what, that's great. We've heard all of that before. We understand that Jesus came in all of these ways, but let's just be serious. Let's look at the end of his life. He dies on a cross. He resurrects from that tomb, and he's at the right hand of the Father. That's what really matters. But I think the Bible tells us something that's really, really important that we need to pay attention to. That in fact, it's vital that we understand what happens as Jesus lives on this earth. That his life isn't just a passing phase of a few years of recorded history, 3 years, and we see what he actually did. It's actually the very blueprint for you and I to understand this is what it means to be people of the way, people of Jesus, that will often be seen as kind of on the outskirts and in the places where power isn't necessarily seen. where for all the ways that we try to make ourselves valuable and important into a world, Jesus would just say, there's something that's going to happen in your life that when you take me seriously, it's probably going to cost you. And it's probably going to set you outside the realm of all the things that are seen worldly as important and give you opportunity to see me do work from underneath the surface. He upsets the entire power structures of the world. That on this earth, as people think that they can hold power through might and force, Jesus says, actually, there's a whole nother kingdom that is taking over. And it happens from the underside and the underbelly of what you think is normal and powerful. And it's going to seem weak and unimpressive. But if you will faithfully follow me, if you'll keep turning your eyes toward me, if you'll keep watching me to see what it looks like to live in this world, I promise you, God says, I will use your life for the glory of God. And so what you and I are challenged with, what we believe is true, is that Jesus is the very example of selfless love that leads us to life. And I just want to pray for us as we are in that place and we're in the reality of the world that we're in today. My prayer for us today, we're going to take communion in just a little bit, but my prayer is that God would begin to get a hold of us so much that wherever we've come from, whatever we're carrying in our suitcase, whatever we think makes sense for life and whatever we've kind of put together as being our powerful sense of self and who we are and what we own and what we have, that we would just begin to unpack that as a community before God and say, God, here's my stuff. You have permission to critique any of this. You have permission to call me into a new way of life. God, you have permission to challenge me and move me at the core of my being to better understand what it looks like to live faithfully after you. Because God, here's my prayer, is that the meeting house, we together in community would trust that God is doing his good work in our world, using all of us in the very unique ways and places that he has put us. That your unique gift set is needed because God wants to use you for others to see the glory of God. God is using us as his church and his people, not trying to be famous or popular or whatever, but being people that are simply faithful. Being people that will continue to look at Jesus and say, that's the life I want. But in order to live that way, I must be changed and I must be conformed. So I want to pray for us as we're in the second week of this, of what it looks like to follow after Jesus. He came in a particular way. And it would probably be good for me, for us, that our life look a little bit like his looked. Even if it costs us, and even if we're misunderstood. So Jesus, here we are as people who believe deeply that the source of life is you. You showed us what it looks like to live faithfully, following after the heart of God. You showed us what it looked like to care for the people around. You showed us what it meant to lean toward those who were on the outskirts, who were marginalized, who were being punished and persecuted. But you didn't use power over to do such a thing. Instead, you humbled yourself and became like us, and the very life you lived showed us what humility looks like. Oh God, I want to confess my own stuff that I want more power, I want more fame, I want more stuff. And I want to lay that at your feet and ask you, God, that in the recesses of every part of my being, that you would transform it and help it to look like Jesus. And that together we would trust you to be one who is actually redeeming the world around us, making things right that are wrong, caring for those that are broken, and that in all of this, we might have a sense that the God who is near us is the God who is going to prepare us to live in this world faithfully after you. God, thanks for my brothers and sisters. Thanks for the meeting house. Thanks for this community of people. We humbly ask you to meet us today and lead us into the days ahead. And we trust you to do that in your name. Amen.